Single dad repairs, stranger's engine in blizzard. Next day, 5 Rolls-Royce arrive at his trailer. Nash Cooper was the kind of man people overlooked, not because he didn't matter, but because he never asked to be seen. If you'd passed his weather-beaten trailer on the edge of Logan County just outside the town limits, you wouldn't have guessed that the man inside would soon become the center of a story nobody would believe unless they saw it for themselves. His life, up until that moment, had been a long series of quiet sacrifices, mechanical repairs, and cold mornings like this one, except this one was colder than most, and something about it felt heavier in the air, like the sky was holding its breath. The wind outside howled like a train, ice clung to the corners of the single-pane windows, and the old furnace wheezed its final breaths before shutting off for the 3rd time that week. Inside, the heat had dropped below comfort an hour ago, but Nash barely noticed anymore. He was already up, already moving, already bracing for the day ahead. His alarm hadn't even gone off yet. He didn't need it. When the anxiety of overdue bills and the pressure of being the sole parent to an 8-year-old daughter lived in your chest every hour of every day, you didn't sleep much anyway. He stood in the narrow kitchen, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of instant coffee, watching the snow fall in sheets through the tiny window above the sink. The light was thin, gray, the kind that didn't promise anything good. The fridge rattled when it kicked on, more noise than cold, and Nash leaned against the counter, surveying what little food they had left. Half a loaf of bread, 3 eggs, a bit of butter, some jelly packets from the diner he used to work at part-time, tucked in the door like backup plans. He looked over at the kitchen table where his daughter, Emma, sat in oversized pajamas, legs swinging back and forth, eyes half awake but smiling. She always smiled in the morning, no matter what. Even when dinner was just toast and whatever canned soup he could warm on the hot plate. Even when the power flickered during her homework. Even when her shoes were tight and her winter jacket didn't quite zip all the way anymore. She never complained, and maybe that's what hurt the most. She knew things weren't right. She knew he was doing his best, and she never asked for more, just like her mother. Emma rubbed her eyes and looked at him. "Can we make pancakes today?" Nash forced a smile. "Maybe tomorrow, kiddo. We're doing scrambled eggs this morning, extra fluffy." He said it like it was a treat, like fluffy meant something, like it made up for the fact that he wasn't sure what he'd make tomorrow if another job didn't come through. She nodded, trusting him, and turned back to the book she'd borrowed from the school library for the 3rd time. Horses, always horses. The stove hissed as he lit the burner. The eggs sizzled in the pan. Outside, the wind was still picking fights with the trailer walls, trying to find a way in. He felt the draft behind him like a warning. His mind drifted to the space above the water heater, where the past due notices were stacked, half hidden, beneath a manual for a truck he no longer owned. Rent was due in 4 days. His mobile repair service had seen exactly 2 jobs in the past week. One of them had paid in homemade bread and a promise. The other canceled when the snow started falling. He remembered a time when he had job security, a steady paycheck, benefits, clock in, clock out. When Emma's mom was alive and the 2 of them would argue about which cartoon she'd grow up loving. Back then, things made sense. Now, every day was a question mark dressed up as a to-do list. Emma's voice pulled him back. "Do you think it'll snow enough for sledding?" He glanced out the window. The snow wasn't stopping anytime soon. "Might be, yeah, if it sticks." "I hope it does," she said. "It's pretty, even if it makes everything else harder." Nash stared at her. This tiny human who understood more than she should have to. She didn't just mean the roads, she meant life. She felt the weight, even if she didn't know how to name it yet. He served her eggs and sat down with his own plate, half as full. She didn't notice, or pretended not to, and they ate in silence for a while, the kind of silence that says more than words can. He looked at her across the table and realized he'd do anything to give her more. Anything. Fix any car, brave any storm, go anywhere. and he was about to. He just didn't know it yet. By the time the sun disappeared behind thick banks of grey snow clouds, the silence outside had taken on a different quality. Not peaceful, unnerving. The kind of silence that told seasoned locals the worst was yet to come. Nash stood on his porch just after noon, arms crossed, listening to the wind push across the frozen fields behind the trailer park. He could barely make out the outlines of the nearby pines as snow began falling in wide, steady curtains. The sky had a strange, suffocating weight to it. It wasn't just a storm, it was a warning. He checked his phone again. Still no messages, no emails, no new job requests. Nothing but a blinking signal bar and the notification that he had 3% battery left. He hadn't charged it overnight. Again. Lately, keeping things powered, devices, lights, heat, was more of a game of chance than a guarantee. He sighed and plugged it into the wall, watching as the charger flickered to life. Then came the text. Just a short message from Wade, the gas station owner and one of the last people in town who still called him regularly. Stranded motorist 10 miles up County Road 6, out of gas. Won't last long in this. Luxury car, fancy type. You in? No signature. Didn't need one. Nash already had his keys in hand before the words even sank in. He wrote a quick note for Emma and taped it to the fridge, just in case. Bonnie Thompson, their neighbor and unofficial grandmother to half the kids in the trailer park, was only a few steps away if anything happened. He knocked on her door before heading out, let her know he'd be gone for a bit. "Blizzard's just getting started," she warned, wrapped in 2 scarves and holding a mug of tea. "Hope it's worth it." Nash just nodded. He wasn't thinking about worth. He was thinking about someone stuck, cold, scared, and the fact that he had tools, a truck, and nowhere better to be. He tossed his emergency bag into the cab, extra gloves, jumper cables, thermal blanket, flashlight, flares, and started the old Chevy. The engine groaned like it hated him personally, but it came to life because it always did. A little like him, really, too stubborn to quit. Snow was already gathering on the hood before he made it out of the park. The roads hadn't been plowed yet, and likely wouldn't be until the storm passed. The county only cleared this area last. He shifted into 4-wheel drive and moved slow, tires crunching across fresh powder. The heater coughed warm air onto the windshield as he tightened his grip on the wheel. Visibility dropped quickly. He could barely see the center line. At times he drove by instinct, trusting muscle memory and the vague familiarity of curves and trees he'd passed 1,000 times. About 5 miles in, he lost cell service entirely. The road was now pure white, no markings, no shoulders, just 2 shallow tire grooves vanishing into fog. It wasn't just snowing anymore, it was dumping, like the clouds had opened every door at once. Ice crusted the corners of his windshield faster than the wipers could clear them. He leaned forward, squinting, searching for headlights, for shapes, for any sign of a car or trouble. The quiet inside the truck was deceptive. Outside, nature was in full revolt. Gusts slammed against the doors like fists. Pine branches snapped somewhere in the woods to his right, and the howl of wind ricocheted through the canyons between the hills. A whiteout like this wasn't just dangerous, it was lethal. 10 miles from town could feel like 100 when the world turned to swirling frost and confusion. And then he saw it, barely, taillights, glowing red through the snow like dying embers. A sleek shape, off the road, nose down in the ditch. It looked expensive, even half-buried. The kind of car you don't see much in Montana, especially not on back roads during a storm. He pulled off as far as he could without joining it in the ditch, hit the hazards, and stepped out into the storm. The wind hit him like a punch. He staggered slightly, breath stolen by the cold. Every inch of exposed skin stung instantly, and snow blew sideways into his face with razor-like sharpness. He zipped his jacket up to the chin, pulled on his gloves, and made his way toward the vehicle. The driver's side window was frosted over. He knocked hard, yelling, "You okay in there?" No answer. He moved to the front and rapped again, harder. This time, The window cracked open a few inches, and a woman's face appeared behind it, mid-50s, pale, trembling, eyes wide with either fear or shock. Maybe both. "I'm Nash," he said loudly over the wind. "Mechanic. Wade sent me. Can you open the door?" She nodded slowly, clearly dazed, and fumbled with the lock. The door creaked open just enough for him to see she was bundled in a thick wool coat, a scarf, leather gloves, all high-end, but nothing built for this kind of cold. Her hands were shaking, lips blue. The engine was off, no heat, no radio, no music, just silence and cold. "I've been here over an hour," she said, voice hoarse. "It died. Everything just stopped." "Your exhaust's probably blocked by snow," Nash said. "Might have triggered a safety shutoff. I'll take a look. Sit tight. I've got heat in my truck if you need to warm up." She nodded again, and he saw it then. Under the shock, under the layers, she was someone used to control, someone out of place out here, in every way. He didn't ask who she was, didn't care. All that mattered was that someone was freezing to death in a storm, and he could do something about it. As he knelt next to the car to inspect the damage, snow piling onto his shoulders, Nash didn't know that this decision, this simple act, was about to reroute his entire life. He just knew that someone needed help, and he had hands built to fix things. That was all he needed. That was enough. The snow had already swallowed the world in silence. Everything beyond a 20-foot radius was a swirling blur of white, erasing the horizon, the road, the very sense of where sky ended and earth began. Nash crouched by the front of the car, brushing away snow that had already formed a thick crust across the hood. The vehicle was angled downward into a shallow ditch. The front bumper cracked from the impact with a hidden snowdrift. A silver emblem peeked out beneath the frost. Mercedes. Of course, it wasn't just a nice car. It was a statement, even half buried in a Montana blizzard. He could already tell the engine wasn't getting fuel. Something had tripped the system, maybe to avoid carbon monoxide buildup. That safety protocol might have saved her life, but now she was one snapped belt or clogged line away from being stranded indefinitely. He popped the hood, the metal stiff and frozen beneath his gloves. A puff of steam escaped when he lifted it, revealing a maze of sleek components dusted in ice. He flicked on his flashlight and started inspecting each piece with the trained eye of someone who'd spent a lifetime diagnosing problems with nothing but instinct and a beat-up socket set. The serpentine belt had snapped clean across the tensioner. One good jolt from sliding into the ditch must have done it. Worse, there was a pool of dark fluid collecting under the engine. Oil, maybe coolant. Either way, the car wasn't going anywhere under its own power. He cursed under his breath, wiped frost off the oil cap, and checked the dipstick. Dry. Too dry. That puddle under the block wasn't just cosmetic. It meant the pan might have cracked on impact. The engine had probably shut itself down to avoid seizing. Smart car, dumb luck. Still, Nash had seen worse, fixed worse, and he had some gear in his truck that might be enough to patch things temporarily, if he could work fast and if the temperature didn't drop further. He looked back toward the cab where the woman still sat, motionless now, probably wondering what her odds were. He waved her over. She stepped out slowly, slipping a little as her boots met the packed snow. Nash offered his arm. She hesitated at first, pride flickering in her eyes, but then accepted the help without a word. "My truck's warm," he said. "You'll freeze in this if you wait in there." She gave a quiet nod, and together they made their way to his idling pickup. The cab was warm, the air thick with the scent of motor oil and peppermint from an old candy cane Emma had left in the cup holder weeks ago. Nash handed her his thermos without asking. Coffee, nothing fancy, but hot. She accepted it with both hands like it was holy, took a small sip, closed her eyes. He could see her starting to thaw, not just physically, but emotionally. The kind of thaw that happens after an hour of fear finally gives way to relief. "I'm Evangeline," she said after a long pause. Her voice was stronger now, but still guarded. Nash Cooper." She studied him for a second. "I appreciate you coming out here. I didn't think anyone would. I've driven in worse, he replied, then gave her a half smile. Not many people out here drive a car like that, though, especially not into the mountains during a snow alert. It was a mistake, she admitted. I was trying to make Billings by evening. I thought I could beat the storm. Nash almost laughed. Montana doesn't care what you're trying to do. Storms win out here. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened a little. Apparently so. He grabbed the radio he kept on his dashboard, checking for updates. Emergency services had already suspended operations until morning. That meant they were on their own for at least the next 10 hours. No tow trucks, no plows, nothing but snow, wind, and whatever tools Nash had in the back. I can try to patch it enough to get you moving, he told her. It won't be pretty, but if the leak isn't too bad and I've got the right belt, I might be able to limp it back to town. Worst case, I tow you with the truck. You do this kind of thing often? More than you'd believe. Out here, you learn fast or you freeze. She nodded, staring out the frosted window. I never imagined I'd end up in a place like this. Stuck, powerless. Nash grabbed his tool bag. Nobody imagines it. Doesn't stop it from happening. He stepped back out into the storm, this time armed with everything he needed, a new serpentine belt, sealant for the crack, and a deep determination forged from years of fixing things that seemed beyond repair. Every time the wind picked up, it tried to rip the wrench from his gloved hands. His jacket clung to him, soaked through the seams. Ice collected in the creases of his sleeves and beard, but he didn't stop. He slid under the car on a flattened piece of cardboard, using his flashlight between his teeth when both hands were needed. His fingers went numb and stiff, moving with instinct more than precision. Above him, the engine's belly looked like a battlefield. The cracked oil pan was worse than he thought, but manageable with the emergency epoxy he'd kept for exactly this kind of disaster. The serpentine belt replacement was more delicate. He had to remove the fan cover, adjust the pulleys, and rethread the belt, all in near-zero visibility with tools that barely fit. Twice, the wind knocked his light over, plunging him into cold darkness. Each time, he retrieved it without complaint. He worked for over an hour, his body aching, knees soaked, jaw clenched tight against the shivers. Finally, with the last bolt in place, he lowered the hood and wiped snow from his eyes. The car wasn't perfect, but it might just make it the 10 miles back to town if she didn't push it too hard. He tapped on the truck window. Evangeline stepped out and joined him. "Try it," he said, nodding toward the Mercedes. She slid behind the wheel and turned the key. For a second, there was nothing. Then the engine coughed again, caught. A low purr filled the air, not smooth, but alive. Nash exhaled, steam pouring from his mouth like relief. "She's breathing." Evangeline stepped out again, staring at the running engine with disbelief. "You fixed it. Enough to get you back, but we're not staying out here. Follow me, slow. Don't stop unless I do. If you lose traction, honk twice." She met his eyes. "Thank you, truly." He shrugged like it was nothing. "Let's just get back before this storm decides it's not done." As they climbed into their vehicles, engines humming under skies that threatened more snow, neither of them had the slightest idea how much this night would change. For her, it was a rescue. For him, it was just another job. But both were wrong. This wasn't just a repair. It was a turning point, one neither of them could yet see, hidden beneath layers of snow and silence. By the time Nash slid back behind the wheel of his pickup, his gloves were frozen stiff, and his fingertips ached in that dull, deep way that told him he was riding the edge of frostbite. He flexed his hands against the steering wheel, trying to stir life back into them, as the wind outside continued to scream like a living thing. The sky was now a deep, colorless gray, the kind that made it impossible to tell if it was late afternoon or already nightfall. He looked in his mirror and saw the headlights of the Mercedes flicker behind him like two faint stars in the middle of a swirling void. It was running, barely, but that was all they needed. 10 miles, That was the distance between them and safety, and right now it might as well have been 100. He shifted into gear and eased forward, careful not to spin the tires too hard on the slick surface. The snow had thickened since he'd arrived, burying his old tire tracks and transforming the road into something more imagined than visible. Every mile they moved forward felt like a battle against nature itself. Trees bent under the weight of the storm, and at several points they had to slow down to navigate around fallen branches or blown debris. The wind gusted sideways, sometimes hard enough to rock his truck in its lane, and more than once he lost sight of the road entirely, forced to drive by gut feeling and guesswork. Behind him, the Mercedes crept along, cautious, its headlights barely cutting through the thick curtain of snow. Nash kept glancing back, checking that she was still there, that the engine hadn't failed again, that the road hadn't swallowed her whole. He could feel the storm trying to separate them, every gust, every flurry, every pocket of black ice. There was a kind of menace in storms like this, not just in the weather, but in the isolation it imposed. It made people feel like they'd fallen out of the world, like they were the last two souls crawling across some endless frozen wasteland. And maybe in that moment, they were. At about the halfway mark, a tree had fallen across the road, just enough to block one lane. Nash pulled over and stepped back into the storm, motioning for Evangeline to stop. His boots crunched through snow as he assessed the damage. It wasn't impassable, but it was close. A large pine, probably 40 years old, had snapped at its base, likely weakened from rot or lightning in the past. It leaned low enough that neither vehicle could squeeze under without risking damage. For most people, that would have been the end of the line. But Nash wasn't most people. He opened the bed of his truck and pulled out the hatchet he kept stashed next to the spare tire and jumper cables. It wasn't much, but it was sharp, and the wood was frozen, which sometimes made it more brittle. Without a word, he started chopping, measured, steady swings, each thud of blade against bark echoing through the woods like a heartbeat. The wind tried to throw him off balance, and snow collected on his shoulders like dust on old furniture, but he kept at it. After several long minutes, he'd cleared enough of the trunk to let one tire pass over it without puncture. He kicked away the loose branches and motioned her forward. Evangeline inched the car through the narrow opening, her wheels crunching over what remained of the trunk. The undercarriage scraped once, but then she was past. Nash followed behind, his own truck navigating the space like it had done 100 times before through similar disasters. Once they were moving again, he realized just how cold he'd gotten during the stop. The tips of his ears burned and his breath came out in ragged, visible bursts that hung in the air even inside the cab. He turned the heat all the way up, even though it meant the engine worked harder. They were too far in to play it safe now. The closer they got to town, the more the storm seemed to push back, as if it knew they were trying to escape it. Snowdrifts became taller, forming natural barricades across the road that Nash had to muscle through with every bit of torque his truck could muster. More branches littered the path. The wind didn't ease. It screamed louder, and the temperature dropped further. The kind of cold that felt ancient, like it belonged in the bones of the earth, not in air meant for people to breathe. But Nash didn't stop. Not once. Because Emma was waiting for him. Because he couldn't leave this woman behind. Because he was the kind of man who didn't run when things got hard. He just braced and pushed through. That was how he was built. It was why people still called him when things went wrong, even when they couldn't pay. He didn't do it for money, he did it because someone had to. Finally, as they crested a small hill near the county road, the first streetlight came into view. Dim, half covered in ice, but there, standing like a lighthouse in a blizzard. Beyond it, Nash could just barely make out the roofs of the gas station and a few neighboring buildings buried in snow, the edge of town. He rolled down his window and waved his arm in a circular motion. Go straight, don't stop. They were less than a mile from the motel. He let her lead now, watched as the taillights turned toward the glowing neon vacancy sign barely visible through the snowstorm. She pulled into the lot and parked. engine still idling. Nash followed and stopped beside her, letting the truck rumble while he caught his breath. His body felt drained, every joint aching from the cold and stress. He hadn't realized how tense his shoulders had been until the sight of that flickering motel sign finally gave him permission to relax. She stepped out slowly, eyes wide as she looked around the snow-covered parking lot like she'd just emerged from another planet. The relief on her face was almost disbelief. She turned to him, her scarf pulled low enough now that he could finally see the fullness of her expression. Grateful, stunned, maybe even ashamed that she hadn't been able to do this on her own. "I didn't think we'd make it," she said, voice hoarse. "You did," Nash replied simply. "You just needed a little help." She hesitated, then extended her hand. "Thank you for everything." He took it, nodding once. "You're safe now. That's what matters." She stared at him like she wanted to say more, maybe explain who she was, maybe ask why he'd come at all. But Nash didn't need that. He just tipped his hat and turned back to his truck, not waiting for fanfare or thanks or anything else. He did what he always did. He fixed what was broken, made sure everyone got home safe, and then faded back into the quiet. But even as he drove away, the storm now behind him, something lingered. A strange feeling in his gut, the sense that this night hadn't been random, that somehow this moment, this woman, this storm, this rescue, meant something more than he could yet understand. He just didn't know how much more, not yet. By the time Nash finally pulled into the gravel lot behind his trailer, the storm had begun to lose some of its fury. Not much, but enough to see his porch light flickering through the curtain of snow. The cold still clawed at everything it touched, and his bones ached with the kind of fatigue that only came from fighting both the elements and time. He parked the truck beside the old propane tank, killed the engine, and just sat there for a long moment, the silence inside the cab pressing in on him. The heat from the vents had faded to a soft whisper, and in its place, the sound of the ticking engine and the occasional pop of expanding metal filled the space like a tired sigh. His gloves were wet, his boots soaked through, and yet somehow, despite the misery wrapped around him, there was a small, unexpected sense of peace. He stepped out into the snow and trudged up the path, his footprints from earlier long since erased. The wind bit at his face, but it wasn't as sharp now. Maybe it was because he'd survived the worst of it, or maybe because he knew, deep down, that he'd done something that mattered. He reached the front door, opened it carefully to avoid waking Emma, and was met with the warm scent of melted wax and peanut butter toast. The power had stayed on. A small miracle. Inside, the glow of a lamp spilled softly across the living room, and there she was, curled up on the couch with a blanket around her shoulders and her sketchbook on her lap. Her head tilted up as soon as she heard the door. "You're home," she said, smiling sleepily. "Course I am," Nash said, kicking off his boots. "Told you I'd be." Emma set the sketchbook aside and hopped off the couch, running over to hug him. He knelt down to meet her, the familiar warmth of her small arms around his neck chasing off the last of the chill. It was these moments, the ones nobody saw, that made the struggle worth it. Not the fixes, not the long nights or thankless jobs. Just this, her, safe, smiling. "Was it bad out there?" she asked, eyes wide. "Yeah," he said softly, "real bad, but it's over now." He didn't tell her about the near whiteout, or the frozen bolts that wouldn't turn, or how close that woman had been to freezing in her car. He didn't tell her about the creeping doubt that had whispered to him halfway through the drive back, asking why he was even doing this for a stranger. Instead, he told her that sometimes people get stuck, and if you're the kind of person who can help, you don't think twice, you just go. And she nodded, like she understood more than a child should, like maybe she'd inherited that same sense of duty in her bones. They had dinner late, canned stew warmed on the stovetop with the last 2 slices of bread toasted until crispy. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot and it was shared. And in the quiet of their tiny kitchen, it tasted better than any meal Nash had had in weeks. They ate by the sound of the wind rattling the windows and the hum of the refrigerator working overtime. Emma asked questions about the car, what kind it was, what went wrong, whether the lady was nice, and Nash answered all of them with careful detail, describing the process more like a puzzle than a job. She loved when he did that, made her feel like she was part of it too. After she went to bed, Nash stayed up, sitting at the table with a cup of instant coffee, staring out the window at the snow-covered world. The roads were buried. The mailbox looked like a ghost of itself. Somewhere, deep in the distance, a plow rumbled past, late, tired, pushing back against a storm that refused to end quietly. He thought about the woman, Evangeline, how her voice shook when she'd first opened the window, how out of place she looked in that car in that moment. She was used to control, used to comfort, and yet she'd been calm in the end, grateful. She'd thanked him like she meant it, and there was something else in her eyes, something she hadn't said, like she was holding back a truth too big to explain at the time. He didn't know her story, and he didn't ask. It wasn't his way, but something about her stayed with him. Maybe it was how she looked at the road when they reached town, like she hadn't seen streetlights in years, or maybe it was how she shook his hand when they parted, firm and certain, as if she'd made a decision she hadn't shared yet. Whatever it was, he couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't just helped someone get home, that something larger had shifted beneath the surface. And it wasn't just his imagination. He finally turned off the lamp, slid into bed with tired limbs, and stared up at the ceiling for a while, listening to the old trailer creak in the cold. There were still bills to worry about, and the rent hadn't paid itself just because he'd done a good deed. Tomorrow, he'd wake up and figure it out, like he always did. But for now, in the quiet aftermath of the blizzard, Nash allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, good things could come from the smallest decisions. That maybe helping a stranger in the middle of a snowstorm could ripple out into something bigger, something that might change more than just the course of a single night. And miles away, in a warm motel room, Evangeline K. Foster sat awake too, staring at her phone, not checking messages or scrolling news. She was staring at a photo, a factory, one she hadn't thought about in years, and the name Nash Cooper lingered in her mind like a spark waiting to catch. It started with a sound, a low, deep hum that didn't belong. Nash heard it before he saw anything just after sunrise, when the snow was still undisturbed and the world seemed to be holding its breath. He had just poured himself a cup of hot water, not even coffee this time, just hot, because the coffee had run out 2 days ago and payday was still too far away to matter. Emma was still asleep, buried beneath a pile of mismatched quilts in the back room, and the trailer was quiet except for the faint wheeze of the furnace kicking on and the wind brushing lightly against the windows. But that sound, it didn't fit. It wasn't the rumble of a snowplow or the sputter of his old pickup engine or the crunch of tires over ice. It was smoother, more refined, and it was getting louder. He stepped outside in his boots and thermal shirt, not even bothering with a coat, too curious to care about the cold. The air was sharp, the kind of cold that stole your breath and made your eyelashes freeze if you stood still too long. But Nash barely noticed it because his eyes were locked on the sight coming down the lane. 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5. 5 identical black Rolls-Royce Phantoms gliding in perfect formation like something out of a dream or a movie he couldn't afford to rent. Sleek, polished, their chrome trim glinting under the weak morning sun as if the snow didn't dare touch them. They moved slow, precise, as if time itself had slowed to watch them arrive. They were completely out of place in the frozen gravel lot of the Logan County Trailer Park, where rusted-out sedans, lifted pickups, and half-buried bicycles were the norm. These weren't cars. They were statements, and they had just pulled up in front of his trailer. Nash didn't move, couldn't move. Neighbors peeked out through blinds, doors cracked open just enough to watch without being seen. Bonnie from 2 lots over stepped onto her porch and whispered a prayer under her breath like she'd seen ghosts. The engines purred into silence all at once. 5 doors opened synchronously, and out stepped 5 people in dark coats, black gloves, and polished shoes that had probably never met gravel, let alone slush. The man from the center car stepped aside, and then she appeared. Evangeline. She looked different this time, still elegant, but in a way that made it clear she had dressed deliberately for this moment. No scarf, no fear, just purpose. Her posture was the same, calm, composed, but something in her expression had changed, like a decision had been made, like she had stopped asking questions and was here to give answers. She walked forward slowly, her boots crunching across the snow. Nash stood still, hands stiff at his sides, unsure if he was supposed to feel proud or panicked. Nothing about this felt real. He had met her less than 24 hours ago, in the middle of a blizzard, on the side of a frozen road. Now she was standing in front of his trailer like it was the White House lawn, and she was delivering a press conference. "Mr. Cooper," she said, her voice carrying clear in the morning stillness. He raised an eyebrow. "We're back to Mr. Cooper, are we?" She gave the smallest smile. "For now." The others remained near their vehicles, respectful, silent, watching but not intruding. Evangeline took a slow breath, then spoke again, her tone shifting to something more formal. "Yesterday I told you my name was Evangeline. What I didn't tell you is my full name, Evangeline Catherine Foster, CEO of Foster Industries." Nash's expression didn't change, but internally the gears turned hard. Foster Industries. Even he had heard that name. They owned everything from manufacturing to tech to real estate, including, he realized in a slow wash of clarity, the factory that had closed 2 years ago and left half the county jobless. His jobless. The very factory he'd worked at for almost a decade before it shuttered without warning. She continued, "When you found me yesterday, I was traveling incognito. I've been conducting a quiet survey of towns affected by recent plant closures. I wanted to see what was left behind. Not data, not reports, people, lives. What happens after we leave?" He folded his arms. "So what? You got stranded in a snowstorm and turned it into a fact-finding mission?" "No," she said, her voice softer. "I got stranded in a snowstorm, and someone helped me without asking for anything in return. Someone who should be bitter, angry, who had every reason to walk away, but didn't. And that made me realize something I should have seen a long time ago." She gestured behind her, toward the phantoms. "These aren't just cars. This isn't some stunt. I brought my executive board with me. We've been up all night talking, reviewing, planning." Nash blinked slowly, still not moving. "Planning what?" She stepped closer. "I want to reopen the factory, and I want you to run it." Silence. No wind, no reaction. Just the sound of a few jaws hitting metaphorical floors as neighbors struggled to process what they were witnessing. Nash let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You want me to run a factory?" "Yes," she replied, absolutely serious. "You have mechanical expertise, leadership instincts, and, more importantly, integrity. You didn't know who I was. You didn't ask for money. You didn't ask for credit. You just did what needed doing. That's the kind of person I want leading people, especially now." He looked away for a second, shaking his head like he was trying to wake up. "I'm a single dad living in a 20-year-old trailer held together with duct tape and prayers. I've got a truck that barely starts and a checking account that hasn't seen 3 digits in weeks. You're talking about boardrooms and budgets and corporate meetings. I'm not the guy." But she didn't flinch. "That's exactly why you are the guy." Another moment of silence passed. Then she reached into her coat and pulled out a thick folder. She extended it to him. "It's all in here. Terms, investment plans, equity offers. The board's agreed to back a new model. Worker first, profit shared, local control. You'd be at the center of it. We'll train you, support you. But it starts with your yes." Nash didn't take the folder yet. He stared at it like it was a stick of dynamite. All he could think about was Emma, still asleep inside, dreaming of horses and warm pancakes. He thought about all the times he'd told her to believe in people even when they don't believe in themselves, about all the nights he went to bed praying for a break, for something, anything, to change. And now change was parked in his driveway wearing leather gloves and a billion-dollar name. Still, he had to ask, why me? Why not someone cleaner, safer, a face your board can trust? Her answer was simple. Because you showed up when no one else would. You didn't save a CEO. You saved a human being. That's the kind of leadership no resume can fake. Nash finally took the folder, his hands shaking slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of what was being offered. Behind him, a curtain moved. Bonnie was watching. Others too. The whole neighborhood had come to a quiet halt, like the moment itself had paused time. And in that silence, something changed. Not in the sky, not in the snow, but in Nash himself. He looked down at the folder, then back at her, and for the first time in a long time, he let himself believe that maybe the storm hadn't just brought trouble. Maybe it had brought purpose. And maybe, just maybe, it was his time to do more than survive. Maybe it was time to rebuild, not just for him, but for everyone who'd been left behind. The board didn't speak much as they stood in the cold, dressed in their expensive coats and carefully polished shoes, their breath forming little clouds in the morning air. They didn't need to. The moment was speaking for itself, and none of them were about to interrupt it. Nash stood there with the thick folder still in his hands, the weight of it more than just paper. In that folder were things he'd never dreamed of seeing with his name on them: contracts, projections, titles, shares, options, and a complete breakdown of how Foster Industries planned to reopen the very factory it had once abandoned. And not just reopen it, but reinvent it. Evangeline took a slow step forward, her voice quieter now, more personal. I didn't come here expecting this. I didn't even plan on stopping in Logan County. My team begged me to skip it, said there was nothing left here, said we'd already seen all we needed. But something told me to keep going. And then the storm hit, and I ended up in a ditch, thinking that might be the end of a bad day. Instead, it turned into the beginning of something I didn't know I needed to see. She glanced around at the people beginning to gather, neighbors bundled in winter gear, silently watching from porches and behind cracked open doors. Some held mugs, others still wore slippers in the snow. They all had the same look in their eyes, disbelief mixed with cautious hope. These were folks who'd been burned before, by promises, by politicians, by people who showed up when cameras were rolling and disappeared the moment reality kicked in. And yet, here they stood, drawn to this scene like moths to a fire. You know, Evangeline continued, her voice growing stronger, when our company pulled out of Logan County, we didn't think twice. We ran numbers. We cited efficiency. We blamed market trends. And we told ourselves people would adapt, find other jobs, move. But we were wrong. We didn't just close a factory. We shattered the backbone of a community. We broke a promise, even if we never said it out loud. And what I saw yesterday, what I felt in the middle of that storm, was the cost of that decision. You, Mr. Cooper, reminded me that a company's legacy isn't measured in profit margins. It's measured in the people who carry on long after the last machine stops running. Nash felt a lump rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down. His jaw clenched, not out of anger, but to keep everything else from spilling out. Too many nights spent wondering if anyone noticed what the closure had done. Too many mornings waking up to a broken routine that once gave people purpose. Too many friends who packed up and left because staying meant starving slowly with dignity. And now this woman, who represented everything that had taken so much, was standing in front of him, not just apologizing, but asking him to be part of the solution. One of the board members stepped forward, tall, thin, the kind of man who looked like he could recite every line of a quarterly report in his sleep. He cleared his throat and spoke carefully. The proposal is real. We've secured funding to retrofit the factory for new production, electric vehicle components specifically, high demand, sustainable and scalable. We'll prioritize local hires, provide training, and reinvest 15% of the profits directly into Logan County over the next 10 years. But none of it works without community leadership, without someone the people trust. That's why we're here. Nash finally spoke, his voice low but steady. You really think this place can come back, after everything? We don't just think it, Evangeline replied. We're betting on it. He opened the folder, flipping through the first few pages. The language was dense but clear. Numbers, incentives, milestones. And there, on the third page, his name, Nathaniel J. Cooper, listed as Head of Operations and Community Development Liaison. He nearly laughed at how fancy it sounded. It was the kind of title that would get you a free coffee in the city. But here, it meant a chance to fix something that had been broken too long. He looked up again, catching the eye of Bonnie, who stood at the edge of the crowd now, one hand gripping a knit scarf at her collar. She nodded slowly, as if to say, "Go on, son. It's your turn now." And he thought of the others. Ricky down the road, who'd lost everything after the plant closure, and now worked odd jobs just to feed 3 kids. Linda, who used to run the cafeteria, now caring for her disabled mother and selling crocheted blankets online. People who had been left behind, told to adapt while the rest of the world moved on. They didn't need a miracle. They needed a start, something to believe in again. This isn't just a job, Nash said aloud, to no one in particular. It's a second chance. He closed the folder, not as a rejection, but a promise. All right, he said finally. Let's do it. The silence that followed was thick with emotion, and then a soft cheer rose from somewhere behind him. Not loud, not dramatic, just honest. A few claps, a couple of tears, a spark catching fire in the middle of a snow-covered field. Emma appeared at the door, still in pajamas, rubbing her eyes and blinking at the surreal scene outside their trailer. Nash turned and met her gaze, nodding once, like he was letting her in on the secret that everything was about to change. Evangeline stepped forward and shook his hand, this time with both of hers, not as a CEO, but as someone who truly meant what she was about to say. "Welcome back, Mr. Cooper," she said. "Let's rebuild this town together." The snow had begun to melt by the time the first round of meetings started. It wasn't much, just a steady drip from the gutters and a soft wetness to the ground where the sun managed to cut through the thinning clouds. But it was enough to feel like a turning point, like the storm had passed in more ways than one. Nash stood outside the community center, still the same weather-beaten building that had hosted everything from school plays to union meetings, and watched as a convoy of dark SUVs pulled into the lot. No more Rolls-Royces this time, just practical vehicles, tinted windows, and people in long coats stepping out with folders under their arms and blueprints rolled tight in their hands. Inside, the old folding tables had been rearranged into makeshift workstations. Laptops were open, coffee brewed in giant carafes, and a whiteboard stood against the far wall, filled with acronyms and timelines, most of which Nash didn't understand yet. The board members and operations crew from Foster Industries moved around the space like they were in a satellite office, focused, organized, efficient, but they were watching him, every single one of them, waiting to see what kind of man they'd just put their faith in. Nash had shown up wearing his best flannel shirt, jeans that didn't have grease on them, and boots that had been wiped clean the night before. He wasn't pretending to be someone he wasn't, but he knew he had to bridge the gap between who he was and who they were asking him to become. The title still didn't sit right in his mouth. Head of Operations. He was still learning what it meant, what it would demand, but the moment he'd said yes, the gears had started turning, and there was no stopping them now. Evangeline arrived last, walking in with a notebook in one hand and a small stack of printouts in the other. She gave Nash a nod as she passed, nothing formal, just a shared look between two people who had made a quiet agreement. No showboating, no press, just results. That was the deal. They began with the layout of the factory. Engineers projected schematics on a portable screen. walking through changes to the assembly line, how the space would be gutted, refitted with EV component stations, streamlined to minimize waste. Nash listened carefully, occasionally asking questions that surprised the suits. He wasn't just a grease monkey who happened into this role. He understood systems, understood how machines talked to one another, and how people needed to feel pride in what they built, or nothing ever truly worked right. He pointed out corners where water used to leak through the roof, suggested insulating the loading dock better to cut down heating bills in winter. One executive whispered to another, "He's sharp," and Nash heard it, didn't let it show on his face, but he heard it. Then came the staffing plans. They'd start with 40 hires, expand to 100 within 6 months. Every position would come with benefits, healthcare, training tracks. No more minimum wage outsourcing, no more temp contracts. Nash insisted that the people who used to work those machines be offered first dibs on every position. The board pushed back. Nash pushed harder. You want community buy-in? You want loyalty? Give it to the ones who never got a goodbye when you shut that place down. They agreed. Next came pay scales, profit-sharing models, a proposed equity system that would make every full-time worker a partial stakeholder after 2 years of service. This isn't just about jobs, Nash told them. It's about making people believe this is theirs again, not just another company that'll leave when the numbers drop. The meetings ran long. Lunch was catered by a local diner that had almost shut down last fall. Evangeline had quietly arranged the order in advance. Small gesture, big impact. The woman who owned the place, Cheryl, cried when she saw the number of trays being loaded into the back. "This'll keep my lights on for another month," she whispered, not realizing Nash was standing nearby. He pretended not to hear, but it sat heavy in his chest the rest of the day. By late afternoon, they opened the doors to the public for an open house. Word had already spread. The parking lot filled with trucks and minivans and snow-dusted boots. People came in cautiously, scanning the displays on easels, the sample renderings of what the factory would look like once renovations began. They asked questions. Some were hopeful, some were angry. Nash answered all of them. No script, no PR spin, just the truth. Yes, it's real. Yes, you'll be able to apply. No, it won't be like last time. And when one man, face lined with years of sun and welding smoke, stepped forward and said, "Why should we trust you?" Nash didn't flinch. He just nodded and replied, "You shouldn't. Not yet, but give me a month and I'll earn it." Emma arrived with Bonnie just as the last presentation ended. She ran up and hugged him, her little face flushed from the cold, eyes wide as she took in the scene. She saw the posters, the models, the charts with his name at the bottom of the leadership team. "You're really the boss now?" she whispered. Nash grinned. "Something like that." Bonnie smirked. "You always were, even when no one was listening." As evening set in and the visitors trickled out, the board began to pack up. Nash stood in the doorway, watching headlights disappear into the snowy dusk, his hands in his pockets, a warm exhaustion settling into his bones. Evangeline came up beside him, sipping from a to-go cup of tea. "You did well today," she said. He shrugged. "We've still got to prove it." "You will," she said confidently. "You've already done more than most people ever would." He glanced at her. "Why are you really doing this? I mean, not the corporate pitch, the real reason." She thought about it for a long moment, then answered softly, "Because I've spent my whole life building things for shareholders. But after that night in the snow, I realized I want to build something that matters to people, that lasts, and maybe I needed saving too." He nodded once. That was enough. No speeches needed. As they locked the doors behind them, Nash looked out at the factory in the distance. Still dark, still quiet, but not for long, because tomorrow the work would begin. And this time, it wouldn't just be about bolts and wires and machines. It would be about restoration, about dignity, about proving that even in the smallest towns, with the simplest people, great things could rise again from the ruins. The folder sat open on the kitchen table, its corners slightly curled from being handled so many times over the past few days. Nash stared at the final signature line, pen in hand, as the late winter sun spilled through the window and onto the faded linoleum. It was quiet in the trailer, that heavy, still kind of quiet that only comes when everything hangs in the balance. Emma was at school. Bonnie had taken her that morning, giving Nash space, knowing without asking that he needed time alone with the decision sitting in front of him. And he did. Not because he was unsure of the answer, but because of what it meant to say yes, to make it official. The past week had moved like a freight train. Meetings, walkthroughs, calls with architects and union reps, town hall forums packed with people he hadn't seen since the factory gates were padlocked. Each day brought new challenges, new conversations. He'd sat across from men and women who had lost jobs, homes, marriages, and somehow they looked at him now like he held the map to something better. That was the hardest part. Not the logistics, not the paperwork, the weight of their belief, because Nash had never led anything more than a maintenance team. He wasn't a businessman. He was a dad, a mechanic, a guy who figured things out by gut and grit, not spreadsheets. And yet here he was, offered a seat at a table that used to be surrounded by suits, now waiting for his signature to bring the plant and the promise back to life. He took a breath, slow and deep, and looked at the photo tacked to the wall beside the fridge. Emma and her mother, taken years ago at the county fair. The three of them had gone together the summer before the closure, before sickness and layoffs changed everything. In the photo, Emma's face was sticky with cotton candy, her mother's eyes laughing, arm hooked around Nash's shoulder. He remembered that day in perfect detail. The breeze, the smell of popcorn and tractor fuel, the way they all believed they had time. He let his fingers trace the pen's barrel. What would his wife have said if she could see him now? Probably something like, "Don't overthink it, Coop. You've always been the kind of man who gets it done, so get it done." And maybe that's what he needed to hear, because beneath the fear, beneath the questions, there was a deeper certainty rising in him, the kind that didn't speak loudly but stayed constant like a heartbeat. This wasn't just about a job. It wasn't just a comeback story or some headline for a corporate redemption arc. This was about roots, about home, about showing his daughter that when life hands you ashes, you don't wait for someone to build the fire again. You gather what's left, you strike the flint, you build it yourself. He signed the papers slowly, carefully, his name flowing onto the line like it belonged there. And when it was done, he didn't feel fireworks or fanfare, just a quiet finality, like the sound of a door clicking shut behind you and the open road stretching ahead. That night, he made dinner with more care than usual. Real food, roast chicken, potatoes, biscuits he made from scratch. Emma helped, standing on a chair by the stove, giggling as she floured the counter too much and dropped a spoon into the sink with a clatter. It was the kind of meal that filled the air with warmth, the kind that said, "We're going to be okay." Afterward, they sat together at the table, and Nash told her what he'd done, how the factory would be hers as much as his, how everything was about to change. Emma's eyes lit up in that wild, unfiltered way kids have when they believe in something fully. "Does that mean I can help pick paint colors for the office?" she asked, grinning. Nash laughed, nodded, then promised she could pick the color for the break room instead, within reason. Later, when she was asleep, tucked in with her sketchpad beside her, Nash stepped outside and stood on the porch. The snow was mostly melted now, leaving behind patches of soggy earth and broken twigs. The stars were sharp above him, piercing through the last bits of cloud, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel weighed down by the cold. He felt ready. Tomorrow, he'd walk into that factory, his factory, and give the crew their first real tour in years. Tomorrow, he'd start hiring the same men and women he once stood beside on the assembly line. Tomorrow, he'd turn lights back on in a building that had sat in silence too long, and he'd do it not because he was a hero, not because he wanted credit, but because he believed in the people who had been forgotten, because he knew what it felt like to be overlooked, and because sometimes the right thing to do wasn't the easy thing or the comfortable thing, but the thing that let you hold your head high when the world finally looked your way and asked, "Are you ready?" He looked up at the stars and whispered, "I'm ready." And this time, he meant it. The morning the factory reopened, the air held a different kind of weight. Not the bite of snow or the damp heaviness of thawing ice, but something older, deeper. Anticipation, a sort of electric tension that rolled through town and settled into every street, every diner booth, every front porch with a view of the smokestack. People had started gathering before dawn. Some came in trucks, others walked from neighborhoods they hadn't left in years without reason. They came in pairs, in families, in quiet groups of 3 or 4. Some carried thermoses of coffee, some brought folding chairs. All of them came with one question pressing behind their eyes: is this real? For nearly 2 years the factory had stood like a grave, not crumbling but abandoned, hushed, windows dark, doors locked, its once vibrant hum replaced by a hollow silence. That place had meant everything to Logan County. It paid mortgages, bought groceries, sent kids to college, kept marriages from falling apart. When it died, something inside the town did too. So many had left. The ones who stayed learned to live in the quiet. But now, that quiet was ending. Nash pulled into the parking lot an hour before the ribbon cutting. Not that there would be a ribbon, not today. No speeches, no media vans, no ceremonial scissors, just steel, sweat, and the start of something new. He parked in the spot closest to the loading dock, still unused to the way people stepped aside for him now. As he stepped out of his truck, he could see a line forming near the entrance gates, former employees, new applicants, and folks just coming to see it with their own eyes. They didn't look hopeful yet. They looked cautious, hardened, like people who'd built their walls high and weren't about to lower them just because someone made a promise. Inside the factory, the transformation was still underway. Crews had spent weeks stripping out old lines, sandblasting grime, reinforcing beams, rewiring ancient breaker panels. It wasn't pretty yet, but it was alive. The scent of machine oil and fresh-cut aluminum filled the air. Work lights buzzed overhead. There were welders in Bay 3 bolting new guide rails, forklifts humming through open lanes, clipboards in every hand. It was chaos, but beautiful chaos. Nash walked through it like a man in a familiar dream, nodding to foremen, checking progress, answering questions, not like a boss, but like someone who had rolled his sleeves up just like them. Because he had. He still did. By mid-morning, the first wave of workers filed in, some returning for the first time since the shutdown, others stepping into a factory floor they'd only ever heard stories about. Nash greeted each one at the door, shaking hands, clapping shoulders, remembering names he hadn't said in years. There was Mickey Jarvis, who used to run Line 4 and once drove 40 miles in a snowstorm to deliver parts during an emergency. There was Lupe Hernandez, who ran the night shift until her husband's stroke forced her to leave. Now she was back, chin high, wearing her old ID badge like a badge of honor. There were newer faces too, young, green, looking around wide-eyed at the sheer scale of it all. Nash made time for each of them, because this wasn't just about reopening, it was about rebuilding trust, and that started at the door. By noon, the factory was humming again, not at full capacity, far from it, but enough. Machines clicked, conveyor belts rolled, sparks flew in the welding bays. There was music playing on someone's radio, faint but defiant. The break room, newly painted in the soft blue Emma picked out, was full of chatter and steam from the coffee pot. Laughter echoed down the halls again, not the loud kind, the kind that came with remembering what it felt like to matter. Nash stood on the raised catwalk overlooking the floor, watching it unfold. Every worker wore a name patch, a hard hat, and the same look of disbelief slowly melting into determination. He saw Emma's drawing tacked to the break room wall, a picture of the factory with sunshine beaming from behind it and people smiling outside. Crayon scrawled across the bottom read, My daddy's factory. His throat tightened. Evangeline arrived just before the lunch shift rotated. She wore boots and jeans this time, her coat a little too formal but not enough to stand out. She didn't ask for attention, didn't call a meeting, just walked the floor with him, listening, nodding, watching the sparks fly and the metal take shape. "You did this," she said softly. Nash shook his head. "We did. You gave it a second chance. I just made sure it didn't go to waste." She paused, then added, "You're going to need help. When the scale picks up, when the orders come in, it's going to move fast." "I've already got help," Nash replied. "The people here aren't just workers, they're the heartbeat. I trust them more than I trust 1,000 boardroom consultants." She smiled faintly. "Good, because what's happening right now, it's going to draw eyes, press investors, maybe competitors. The question is, are you ready for what comes next?" Nash looked out over the floor again. He saw Lupe helping a new guy find the tool locker, Mickey giving a thumbs up from the far end of the line. He heard the machinery singing its old tune again, and for the first time in a long time, he felt not just hope, but control. "Let 'em come," he said. "We're just getting started." That evening, after the last shift clocked out and the final lights dimmed for the night, Nash locked the factory gates himself. His hands were blistered, his shirt stained with oil, and his shoulders heavy, but the good kind of heavy, the kind that comes from purpose, not pressure. He climbed into his truck, the radio playing low, and as he turned down the long drive leading back toward town, he saw something he hadn't noticed that morning. A sign, newly posted by the county. "Welcome to Logan County, home of the Rebirth Plant." And underneath that, in bold black letters, "Operated by the people who built it." Nash grinned, because finally, they were being seen.